This is Lessons Learned, and I'm your host, Matt Kennard, CEO of Better Lesson. Join me as we dig in with visionary state and district level leaders who share our mission to support every K-12 educator in developing the next generation of resourceful, compassionate, and resilient learners. Lessons Learned is brought to you by Better Lesson. Let's get started. Okay, it is great to see the Better Lesson crew out there. This is Lessons Learned Season 2. I am so excited. These are my favorite episodes. And, I get to meet with such incredible folks sharing incredible work that they're doing around the ed tech world. But my favorite moments are the moments when I get to highlight someone who's part of the Better Lesson family, a member of our team. We have Dr. Stephen Gering here joining us today. So, Stephen, welcome. So excited to have you here.
Thank you so much. Excited to jump into the Better Lesson family and to have this conversation around college and career readiness. Really excited.
Fantastic. Well, a little bit of background for folks. Stephen, in addition to having been an award-winning principal, was the former chief academic officer of the Spokane Public Schools. He was also a part of the ABLE team that was acquired by Better Lesson earlier this year. We are so excited to have him here now as our director of solution design and one of our subject matter experts, thinking a lot about college and career readiness, CTE pathways, academic offerings, and resourcing. So, Stephen, it is awesome to have that there. You've had such an impressive background that's brought you to this work. But I think the question that people always want to know is, what brought you into education in the first place?
Yeah, fun conversation. Entered kind of backwards. I was accepted to med school right out of my undergrad and got into med school, was ready to go. And the exact same week I got into Teach for America. And I called up the med school and asked for a deferment and got a 2-year deferment, much to my parents' terror. And that we didn't go straight to med school and went to the Rio Grande Valley of Texas and just fell in love with teaching and coaching and really thought back on who impacted my life the most. And it was teachers, coaches, youth group leaders. It was folks that really impacted my life growing up, and really decided that's what I wanted to do, was spend my time pouring into the lives of young people and really making an impact. So stayed in education and taught and coached down there, then went to Massachusetts and then been an assistant principal, district leader for decades, working on school turnarounds and school and district leadership. And I've learned so much and feel really blessed to have been in education.
One question I love to ask folks especially who kind of found their way into education, maybe it wasn't the first thing that they were thinking about, what has been for you the beauty of those decades of work? What is the thing that resonates the most with you, or maybe thematically you've carried with you that entire time?
Yeah, I think it's the impact. That's really what drives me in my career is the individual stories, the relationships, but the impact. And I can think of former students I'm still in touch with, the individual stories, and the work. I'm really proud of what I've accomplished in the past and the people I've gotten to work with. So the relationships and the impact really what fuels me and drives me.
Love it. I love it. One of the themes for season 2 this year has been talking about this concept of college and career readiness and thinking about that portrait of a graduate and how it's changing. And obviously, we think about popular topics in education today, whether it's AI or high quality instructional materials. I think all those things are incredibly important, but they're all in service of something which I think is, how are we preparing students to be ready for what's next for them? How are we preparing educators to help deliver on that promise? And college and career readiness feels like the right aperture for us to be thinking about it, because, now I'm getting to my own personal soapbox. It feels like in many ways we've let high school slip as an important capstone educational event in the United States in favor of graduating from a 4-year university, when the reality is that's not necessarily how we should be thinking about, our high school graduates and where they're headed. Can you talk a little bit about what drew you into the world of college and career readiness, that fascination for you, and maybe talking a little bit about destigmatizing the career part of college and career readiness as we think about a more well-rounded student exit pathway.
Yeah, that was a lot in that. There's a lot of really good questions there. Um, I think I want to start with two things can be true at the same time. And I think we've forgotten that. So let me start there. Two things can be true. We need more bachelor's degree students in the United States. The state where I'm at, we're projected, that's the fastest growing area. So it's still the fastest ticket for most students. And what you said is true. Do all students need a bachelor's degree? No, they do not need a bachelor's degree. There's other routes forward. But two things can be true. So we need more college graduates. We need more bachelor's degree. We need to open up access. So that's true. And there's some incredible routes. Certificates, trade school, technical school, 2-year apprenticeship in some areas. And we just need to be able to talk about that. Right. My concern, Matt, and some of the recent data post COVID is we're having this national discussion about college and career readiness, people backing away from.
We were recently talking to the director of CTE in Enrico, and one of the things that stuck out to me is he would say, enrolled, enlisted, employed does not matter to us as long as it feels like it's accretive to the student. It's helping them fulfill what they want, what matters to them. And it seems like there's something very similar for you in the idea that post-secondary, that you're moving on to something that's fulfilling, whether it is a 4-year college or a 2-year college dual enrollment, doesn't enlistment, any of those things can be simultaneously true. It almost feels like what you're getting to is, how do we have better conversations with students and their families to help them understand how you backwards map from, say, sixth grade, from that outcome to where you may start in sixth grade. And it seems to me one of the things that I talk a lot about is I want to kill the idea that the number one reason that you go to a 4-year college is your parent went to a 4-year college, because that to me feels like such a communication gap problem that's immediately solvable. How do you think about that backwards mapping idea? How can administrators and district leaders, but even classroom teachers or parents who may be listening, start thinking about that a little bit differently?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think we're under investing in the amount of guidance and counseling that we're providing to students and families to help them backwards map. And the data shows. So when you look at the data, we're over relying on families bringing to bear their own background and their own individual knowledge, their own connections to navigate and do their own backwards mapping. I think that, and that gets back to one of your earlier questions. What I had you asked about this kind of epiphany I had in my career, or what really focused me on college and career readiness. I wasn't when I started. My first administrative, first 6-8 years, really wasn't focused on it. And what really shifted for me was a turnaround high school, uh, high poverty, and I got to that school and looked at the data, and I saw the courses that my students were taking. Somebody did a transcript analysis. So the state of Washington at that time commissioned a study. I saw the transcript analysis, and I saw the courses that my students were taking on this side of the freeway were wildly different than the students on the other side of the freeway from the wealthy part of town. And that's really what drove me, Matt, was when I saw that, oh, it's the guidance and advising we're providing families, and our students, we say it's student choice. And in reality, it's not choice for most families. They don't know how to navigate and how to backwards map, because we didn't provide enough time and guidance. And it ended up in wild disparities in terms of what courses, the electives that students on this side of the freeway were taking versus the electives that students on that side of the freeway were taking. So really making sure that our families had access and choice, which we saw really large increases in post-secondary attendance when we started doing that. And we trusted you all. So families really, really want and trust schools to be doing that kind of guidance and advising. And it's not happening by and large. We're spend a lot of time on crisis counseling, social emotional counseling, and not near enough time on the backwards mapping to what you're saying.
It's such an interesting place to be, because when you put together destigmatization of the outcome, right? Going into career is great. Going into 4 2-year college is great. Going into trade school is great. Finding vocation is great. And you say, hey, here are the things that need to happen from middle school and high school to get you to any of those outcomes. It feels like we're starting a whole new conversation that is more factually based versus emotionally based, which I think has some real benefit. I think the real question for me is, how do we also tie in data? How do we start thinking about preparedness in a way too that feels easier for everyone to have a somewhat unified view on? I know we think about things like preparedness in the form of of rigor, right? What's the persistence? What does course completion look like? What does access to advanced courses look like? How do you think that districts and states can adopt better tools to maybe talk about both the pathways and the rigor of those pathways to prepare kids?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the concerns I have, Matt, in some of the latest iterations, as career has taken a stronger role, which is great. One of my concerns is we have a misunderstanding around what has shifted inside those careers. So, for example, I was talking to a group of 45 superintendents last week. I put up a chart on Lexile levels and I showed them out of the 16 career clusters. And I think people are really surprised when they see this one. The one that requires the highest reading level, manufacturing. So, destigmatizing in people's mind, like, do students in manufacturing have to go to a bachelor's degree? No, that's not what I'm saying. But we have to shift in our mind the base reading level, the base math levels, in order for a student to succeed in that pathway, just as an example, is higher than an entry college lit major. And when people start understanding that, it's like, oh, because I think we still have in our minds, there's these like 4-year college bound kids and they need this academic. And then there's something less that these hands-on career. And it's like, no, that's not true. Does everybody need the same route? Absolutely not. But the base foundation has shifted because of technology, because of AI, because of what's happened inside technology. The reading manual for an automotive manual is at a higher level than a college lit major because of the shifts of technology. So I think if people get that in their mind, that the base level of education necessary is lifted, I think that'll help a lot. But I definitely run into this conversation a lot where people have kind of these 2-tier tracks in their mind, and students don't always on the career side get a robust academic offering to couple with their CTE pathways. Now, to your second part of your question, what should we be measuring? The evidence shows we should be measuring uh, multiple things, but one, we should have a robust look at the academic coursework. So the one that I talk a lot of around the United States is the single biggest predictor out of all high school metrics is the intensity of the high school curriculum. Does that need to be the same for all students? No. But what we're finding in our data, Matt, is that the intensity of the high school curriculum is incredibly predictive. There's a continuum. So some students definitely can take more, but there's a minimum threshold. If students don't get to a minimum threshold of academic intensity, their likelihood of enrolling, persisting, completing some post-secondary, again, trade school, technical school, 2-year, 4-year, drops dramatically. So really helping school districts monitor, are your students getting a baseline academic intense experience, couple that's core curriculum plus CTE? Then there's a continuum beyond that minimum threshold where students have lots of choice and there's lots of options, and it doesn't all have to look the same. But I'm trying to really help school districts monitor that and get past that minimum threshold. I think is one of the most important pieces of advice I would give school districts, is that every school district should be tracking and monitoring who's getting access to what combinations of courses, and are their students minimally prepared for a variety of choices and options after high school.
You know, I think that public education's an incredibly important thing. I think it's, part of the American dream, right? Like that we have free, robust public education. I think our system has worked really well at various points. I think one of the things that I I think a lot about, to your point here, is there is now the shadow of charters and private schools. Right? And I think one of the things that I think is worth noting, because we should learn from education systems that exist outside of our standard public school system, whether it is internally to the US or externally, looking at a Singapore or a Scandinavian system or a German system, where we're seeing a lot of things that we're talking about, destigmatization of career, right? Thinking about what are those various pathways, but also keeping rigor. Really great educational institutions, and I think we can see it in various places, do a few things well, and they insist on minimum rigor for students. There's an idea that, like, if you're here, you can do it. And if we're going to set up the right non-core instructional minutes, we're going to make sure the right curricula in place, but we're going to have the right support systems, whether it's guidance, et cetera, communication, family engagement, that I think we can continue to learn from. And I think this is where you're pointing to say, like, these are some of the tenets of what makes great education. I think one of the big ones is limiting the number of things that we're trying to accomplish as a school district or as a state, to say, hey, if we're going to do CTE, for instance, what are those high wage, high availability jobs that helps keep talent in your state? If we're going to get into prepping for 4-year college, what does that pathway look like? But in all cases, how are we maximizing rigor for students? How are we maximizing it to ensure that for every student who's on their journey, they have both the counseling and guidance support, but also access to the courses and classwork that maximize the rigor of their experience, right? Because, by the way, if you're going into career or college, we want the most competitive, best trained, best educated kids that we can put into any of those circumstances. How do you think about for a district who may be sitting there saying, hey, we've tried to lean into choice for students, we've tried to make it more exciting and interesting. You know, we've got 250 pathways of matriculation. What would you say to a district there? Because it feels like the numbers would say it's great that you have the choice, but we're not necessarily producing the college and career ready students that we're hoping to produce.
Yeah, it's spot on, Matt. So we've analyzed hundreds and hundreds of thousands of transcripts across the United States, small school districts, large school districts. Um, Pretty safe to say, when you look at the data, Matt, that the more choices and options that are offered almost across the board, and I'll give one exception to it, the more choices and options that you offer almost always lead to really big inequities. So people say, oh, we have like student choice, student driven schedules. We lay it out there, kind of trying to implement kind of a college model, all these choices, all these options, letting families navigate. And almost universally, it results in really large inequities. You can almost predict it's by family socioeconomic status. Wealthier families are choosing very different packages on courses than families who have never had somebody go to post-secondary. Often historically underserved students don't get access to the same courses. So to your point, almost universally, the only exception that I've seen is in maybe the wealthiest public high schools in the United States, where, the top
Well, but
5%.
they fund at the level of Andover or an Exeter, right? Or a Harvard Westlake.
Choice works there. But actually it's kind of counter, because to your point, almost 100% of those students are going on to 4-year at those public high schools. So the choice works because it's all within a very narrow band is what those families are choosing. But to your point, less is more almost universally. So the advice and guidance I give to school districts is pare down if possible. People that really push back against the paring down, I still give that advice. The other part I'd say is you have to invest more in your guidance and advisement. Bringing 500 juniors to the theater and throwing a massive course catalog and telling them to choose their courses for the next school year in 30 minutes is not going to help certain families navigate that massive course catalog. Like, what should I be choosing? Which courses? What should I take? It's just not enough guidance and advisement. I'm a huge advocate, Matt, for all adults. If you look at the ratio of adults in our public schools to students, it's about 18 to 1. If we all advise a group of students, we actually can have some really, really high quality advisement and guidance. if we don't just rely I'm a huge proponent of counselors, but there's no way a counselor can, in a ratio of 300, 500 to 1, provide the guidance and advisement that we're talking about to help families navigate, unless you really start paring down that course offering and course catalog.
You know, just to give a personal anecdote, and I think it will largely support what you said. I went to a very small all boys high school. I think I've mentioned that before in Boston, with a graduating class of 42, and it was 7 through 12, school. So you have 300 and some odd kids, in the school, and you think about the support I got to receive. I had 6 advisor letters a year. There were parent teacher conferences multiple times in a year. So much of the investment really was actually around advice, guidance, support, understanding of myself and my journey, where to push, what the push would look like, open communication with my family. I had 2 lawyers for parents, so like they've been through this process before, they understood it. Those are some of the things that, you know, that's not about the curriculum that you choose. That's not really about the pathways. It's about how you build that support. And I'm not suggesting that every district obviously has the funding and ability to do so. But the more we can think about paring things down to open up space for that, to open up investment of resources around that, makes a lot of sense to think about that type of support, because really helping kids feel seen and heard, respected, families feeling like they're connected to the academic journey for their kids makes such a difference in their ability to kind of work together to get there, which I know most of our folks know that implicitly. The question is, can we actually use the structure of our districts now to get there? And I think that reformation around academic offerings, supporting rigor, but also supporting it with better communication, a better understanding of where both your core and non-core instructional minutes are going, be it support or time in classroom, makes a huge difference.
So ready. I saw a higher ed study that connected to what you're talking about too, Matt, where they looked at uh, community colleges, public community colleges, and then they looked at elite liberal arts schools. And what they found was that the narrow choice offerings at the elite liberal arts schools actually led to way more equity than what the community colleges, navigating the volume for people and choosing the when they studied it, they found like students were taking the wrong courses, the wrong classes that didn't count, classes. So it ended up with a whole lot of students not graduating, students taking courses that they didn't need to, they couldn't figure it out. The elite liberal arts, the focus resulted in much, much more equity. I think our public schools often keep trying to create new courses um, and oftentimes when we go, we see the courses that were created over decades and that they just have this large, large volume. And then it starts leading to very different curricular experiences and very different post-secondary outcomes for students who choose some of those different pathways. The other thing too that you talked about around the European system, those pathways for the career are incredibly richly infused with core academics. So those students have really strong math backgrounds, really strong STEM backgrounds. The new generation of CTE that I'm really excited about does that. So when you look at best practices in CTE, it's couples core academics, really rich core academics with highly infused academics inside their CTE experience, along with dual credit, meaningful industry credentials, uh, really, really high powered in a very narrow CTE offering in those pathways. Like you look at some of the best CTE pathways that are mimicking some of the European systems, those students have a really, really rich core academics, core CTE, infused math, infused science, infused literacy. And it's really easily like very prescriptive CTE courses. Sometimes we work with school districts and they offer like a business pathway or a CTE pathway, and there's 8, 10, 12 courses that are all under enrolled, not really tightly focused in terms of like, what are we offering here? And we see students taking the 4th year course before the 1st year course. Like it's not sequenced. It's not brewed. It's not a progressively building towards a capstone experience where all of our students will get a um, high in demand industry certificate for a high growth, high wage pathway. It's often just this kind of a scattershot approach, even within the CTE.
I love thinking about CTE is, you know, as HQIM, right? Like it, because at the end of the day, it is two, I think, common things that are hard. One is, I think, building progression in CTE pathways can be hard. How do you build some upstone? Can you talk a little bit about how districts can help people get over kind of like the taste tester syndrome, right? Where they're jumping, kids are jumping. And I think the other thing is how how can industry help support this going forward? As you think about that kind of public-private relationship, what would you encourage districts and states to be thinking about in terms of that partnership?
There was a lot there. That's good. Let's start with district best practices. One thing I run into a lot, Matt, is kind of this misnomer around what we call the dabbler when we measure kind of that scatter shot approach. A lot of folks push back and they're like, I want that. I want my student taking a cooking class and a computer course and an engineering course and and really best practice shows moving that down to middle school. So students are exposed to a variety of options much, much earlier in middle school. They get that exposure and then in depth in high school. So as much as possible, we're not asking people to choose majors in the United States. It's one of the strengths of our public education system. But there's really good evidence that the dabbler in high school, especially when they have a weaker academic core coupled with that, they are the most at-risk students in the United States. So shifting that to the middle school is one best practice. Another thing I'm a huge advocate for is adopt, when possible, some of the best CTE curriculum from outside organizations in the United States. There's some really good PTEC, Project Lead the Way. I mean, there's some great national organizations where industry partners, to your point, have partnered to design pathways that are in demand, high growth, high wage, world-class curriculum coupled with professional development that really helps build teacher capacity. So when possible, don't try to do it your homegrown. It's harder. It's not impossible, but it's much, much harder. And then when you are doing your homegrown, really thinking about ensuring it's high growth, high wage, and are we preparing our students? So one of the cautions I would give there is you might have an industry partner on your advisory board that wants workers for their job, but we got to also keep in mind, which is good, we should be preparing them for that local industry. But the likelihood right now, Matt, is that they will have to go back to school 5 to 7 times to retool. So the best evidence is not preparing students for narrow careers, is preparing them for a career pathway. So getting away from welding 1, 2, 3, 4, there's a high likelihood that welding will be reduced dramatically due to AI. But you're exposing them to welding inside a much broader pathway. So we're preparing students for career fields, not for a narrow job, because we know that that narrow job likely will disappear. They're going to have to go back. They're going to have to retool. So how do we think about career fields versus narrow jobs or narrow pathways that really limit students? And that's a big shift that we need to make inside some of them, particularly some of the more homegrown pathways that I see across the U.S.
And it feels like that connection then to business councils and jobs, it also becomes a good conversation with those folks to say, what are the fields that you're thinking about? Where are those expansion pathways and how are we preparing it? Because, I think about a lot of states, if you're not, a tier 1 destination city, if I'm in Wisconsin, I want to keep kids in Wisconsin and not immediately have brain drains into Chicago, right? Like great for Chicago, but not necessarily great for Wisconsin. So it seems like a really good way for us to think about how do you keep people in and people who are likely to stay in the long time and like justify that investment. The last piece that I think is important is think about obviously resourcing. We're in a time of some budget uncertainty and obviously we're post ESSER, but it also feels like there's opportunities for districts to use this narrowing, higher communication, better partnership to also take a look at practices and say, hey, what can we be reinvesting from things that we've been invested in before? And it's not about getting rid of teachers or changing things. It's actually about how do we re-architect how we're using our educators in best service. How do you think about that? And how do we, in a time when it's often hard to have that conversation about, resource allocation, How can we help folks think about that as reinvestment opportunity?
Yeah, there's a lot there. There's good evidence, Matt, that the fewer options you have and really focus on strategic scheduling. So having a point of view and really actively recruiting students into those fewer options, you can have a much more efficient, a much more effective schedule, which not to save money, we're public educators, we're trying to invest, allows you to take those extra dollars and have a huge investment inside your own schools, inside your own districts when you don't offer the same breadth and options. So that's one thing to really pay attention to is fewer options leads to a more efficient schedule, which allows you to reinvest those dollars. Again, it's hard for schools and school districts to think about narrowing. That's one option. Another thing, Matt, that piece of advice on what you're saying is really, I find educators don't pay attention to their pipelines. So, for example, maybe a CTE pathway, or I'll see it in World Link. You see it in lots of places. 25, 30 students start year one, but they're not paying attention to their 4-year yield. And what it does is it creates these really difficult tensions 3 years down the road. So I'll use a world language one, for example, but it happens in every single subject, including CTE. 25 students start in French one, and then there's 3 students who want French four, and you're at a really difficult situation going, well, I guess we don't offer it, or maybe those families show up at the school board meeting. They're wanting their students the opportunity to be in that. We don't know what to do. We end up offering really small courses or a poor curricular experience where we combine the three, French 3 and French 4. We see it in CTE where there's 6 kids, 8 kids, 2 kids that want that course. So really thinking about what's my starting pipeline and really figuring out what's my yield through that pipeline and then intervening. And this is the part where I see lots of passive scheduling where people just get the numbers and kind of passively turn it over. If Matt, you're at the district, I'm like, well, Matt, do you want me to cut it? There's only 8 students signed up. It's like, no, I don't want you to cut it. I want you to fill the course up. Go recruit students, go find the students, fill that course up, market that. I know I had a big epiphany when I had to start marketing what we were offering. I never thought about that as a public educator. It's like, oh, I have a point of view and I'm trying to promote something. That was never on my radar as a public school educator that I had to do that, and that I was actively trying to fill those up. Like I wanted more sections of physics, more sections of pre-calc. I wanted to fill up our high growth, high wage CTE pathways. That if the numbers don't come in right away, you have to go actively recruit kids into that. That's a shift for a lot of educators where a lot of people just say, that's the numbers I got. And then it really creates these budget crises that have some really difficult decisions that don't need to be as difficult of a decision. Particularly the other thing I would say too, Matt, is shifting all of this back in the calendar. So really thinking strategically. If you wait till the end, you're not going to have time to do this kind of strategic scheduling that we're talking about. Moving that back much, much earlier, collecting those course requests in January or much earlier after a really robust advising process, which then allows you to be very strategic with your numbers and do what we're talking about and engage in this active recruitment. Some school districts have such compressed timelines, it's impossible to do what we're talking about because everything waits so long into the spring and they just don't have time to be strategic. So it ends up being a lot of reactive scheduling, which creates some budget crises that don't need to be there if folks really rearrange their thinking about the importance of strategic scheduling and kind of having this be a 12-month part of your calendar, not just a couple months at the end of the spring.
You know, thinking about all of these pieces together, you know, scheduling is a delicate internal thing. Professional learning is as well. What would you say to folks who are trying to figure out, you know, getting comfortable with working with, like, for instance, a better lesson where we bring scheduling and professional learning together? What are the benefits of working with an external party to help you think through this?
Lots of benefits. I know as part of my graduate program, you talk to counselor programs. It's never part of any sort of graduate program. So most times when we work across the country, people say it's homegrown. I figured out how to do this. Sometimes people love doing the puzzle or love it, or you might have had some mentor that really showed you, but the variability, Matt, is incredible. It's almost always kind of homegrown. If you happen to have a mentor, a principal that showed you how to do it, or a counselor that really took a lot of passion in. So one thing about partnering with outside folks is it creates an actual curriculum and an actual program and actual tools that you can systematize. So every single school leader, every single school is doing the same thing and is learning the same. And I really talk about investment in the future. And so I spend a lot of time, sometimes school districts like, oh, I just want to have maybe the principal or the assistant principal curriculum. And I'm like, pause a second. You're also training your future principals here. So let's stop having that person do discipline for 8 years and then be named the principal of the high school. I see this all the time. They're like, oh, I did discipline the whole time. I never, ever was engaged in a conversation around curriculum. And now I'm named principal of the high school. And I've never even
By the
thought
way,
about
that's your instructional leader, right? Like that
it.
principal is your instructional leader in the building.
We underinvest in our future leaders so much. We often do. I get that you can say, yeah, your main job is going to be doing ninth grade discipline, or your main job is going to be doing athletics. But pause, folks. We have to have a much better training program for these future leaders so that they don't step into their future role as an instructional leader and is shocked and say, and I'm working with one right now, and she's never been involved at all in any curriculum, any sort of scheduling. That just wasn't part of her training. So outside partners bring that in. And I think sometimes a fresh perspective. Uh, when you have been doing it, you've run into a lot of times. So I've been doing this for 20 years, same thing. We've only ever had one pre-calc section. We've never even thought about that. We've never had physics. I was out of high school, almost no students taking physics. And they're like, we just never thought about it. Like having an outside perspective, national benchmarks, regional benchmarks, data to help drive the decisions. And a different perspective when you have folks that have been ingrained in that, maybe have moved up in that system, you just don't know what you don't know. And I wouldn't have either. So I think outside data, outside benchmarks, and outside perspective, and then a real curriculum and scope and sequence to something as important. 80% of our budget is people in our school systems. And the biggest predictor is the courses that we offer. So you should be paying more attention to that. When you talk to a school leader and say, what's your budget? They'll often say like 5,000, 10,000. What they're talking about is their like budget for copies or budget for their supplies. No, you're running a multi-million-dollar budget. Even in our middle schools and high schools, that's a multi-million-dollar budget. You don't feel it because you're given like a set 100 FTE or 60 FTE. And no, that's a multi-million-dollar budget. And how you deploy that, we really invest in training future leaders and current leaders on how do you invest this multi-million-dollar budget to have more students college and career ready and run it effectively and efficiently. It's kind of mind-boggling how little we invest there and how we invest maybe more in running a title budget or a $10,000 copy budget that stays under when it's not nearly as important and not nearly as impactful.
Listen, I am so grateful to you, Stephen, for getting to share with our listeners what I get to be privy to seeing on a regular basis with our partners and internally.
Yeah, I definitely have a lot of hope in our current leaders, our current leadership. Geez, I was with a large urban school district last week. Today I'm with a small rural school district. I think COVID's over and people are past that, Matt. And it's exciting to see. For a year or two after that, there was a lot of the catch up. And I know that's still an issue in terms of catching students up, but I think people have shifted and there's a real hunger right now for leaders to really jump into this work and do this work that I wasn't seeing in the midst of all of that chaos of COVID and post-COVID. People are really hungry to do this work and are really bought in and believing. It's just palpable, it's noticeable. So I'm really excited about the people I get to interact with. I was thinking in that large urban school district last week, the quality of the leadership, the passion of those folks in that room, the commitment of those folks to all students. It's energizing. It's exciting. Some of the levers that they're pulling in order to make gains going forward. So I see it, and I see a real hunger, Matt, that I didn't see in the middle of all that COVID work for folks to really dig in. And I'm seeing some renewed energy. I think we got away, unfortunately, from some of this work around curriculum, instruction, professional development. And I'm starting to see a lot more hunger for that again. And people realizing that the pendulum swung a little too far one way, and people are really wanting to roll their sleeves up and say, the most important things is what we're teaching and how we're teaching. And I can see it, and I hear it around the country. So I'm really hopeful about that.
There we go. Dr. Stephen Gering, Director of Solution Design here at Better Lesson. So grateful to have you on. Lessons learned. Season 2 continues, college and career readiness. We're excited about it. Thank you for the time today.
Thanks for this opportunity. It was a great discussion. Appreciate it.
That wraps another episode of the Lessons Learned podcast. Thank you for listening. For show notes and more about Better Lesson, please visit betterlesson.com/podcast. Lessons Learned is hosted by Better Lesson, the leading provider of data-driven, high-impact, system-wide K-12 teaching and learning solutions. We partner with states and districts to support every educator in developing the next generation of resourceful, compassionate, and resilient learners who are college and career ready. Our work has impacted more than 80,000 educators and nearly 3 million students nationwide. See you in the next episode.